afternoon. My name is Andrew Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for International Private Enterprise. And I'd like to welcome you today to our afternoon session called The Weight of Corruption on Women Leaders in Africa, featuring President Dr. Joyce Banda. And I will let the introductions happen in a little bit. My job really here is just to welcome you here to CIPE. And Dr. Banda, President Banda, is the former President of Malawi from 2012 to 2014. But equally as important to us, she's a former CIPE grantee and partner going way back to 1996 in her organization, the National Association of Business Women in Malawi. We gave our first grant to Dr. Banda's organization the first year I was working here, actually. So it's been quite a journey, I think, for both of us in that regard. Originally, CIPE worked with them on 3 occasions with the association, really to help strengthen the association and its capacity to represent the interests of women in Malawi, but also, and now we've also gave them a grant to work on what we call a national business agenda, which is really an advocacy-oriented program. Maybe you've got the political bug back then, doing that advocacy work that was so successful. We're pleased to observe now that the National Association has about 30,000 members, and it's a leading organization in its country. A little background on CIPE and why we're interested in this particular topic. You know, CIPE has 5 areas of focus that we like to talk about. Our first is looking at what we call enterprise ecosystems, and that's really how laws and regulation affect the ability of the private sector to develop. Our second is a keen interest in democratic governance, and that's both the quality of governance in the public sector, but also corporate governance in the private sector. We focus a lot on trade and the impact of globalization and really trying to democratize globalization and allow more people to access the benefits from globalization. We do a lot of work, as we did with the National Association, on business advocacy. And finally, we do a lot of work on anti-corruption. And that's sort of what brings us here today for our discussions, where a lot of these things intersect. Anti-corruption, advocacy, good governance, etc. It's important to us because when we talk to people in the private sector, we often see that corruption follows a pattern, in a sense, or a degradation. Often small businesses and environments occur in countries where businesses, small and mediums and even largest, might bribe to get a slight competitive advantage or some sort of thing that helps them get established and move forward. Very often that type of corruption goes from being something where people seek advantage to something that becomes extortionate. And it becomes something that actually starts to destroy businesses. And in the scale and the complexity of what happens, it really starts to eat away at a business bottom line. As you have to pay more and more and more people seek these types of bribes, and then it affects all of society. So we see this then as a business issue because it really does affect the competitive ability of companies and their efficiency within an economy. And finally, it has that effect of eroding governance in the country and increasing the overall competitiveness of the nation. So what can start as a very microeconomic phenomenon in a small business, maybe trying to get a license or a permit, can eventually lead to the downfall of the state. And we're seeing some of the effects of that around the world. At CIPE, we take a multi-pronged approach when we take a look at corruption because it's a fairly complex thing. So we have a fairly substantial program now trying to work with small and medium enterprises on compliance-related issues. How do if I want to join a value chain in the world, if I want to join, a General Motors value chain, a garment value chain. There are a lot of standards out there that I have as a local company now to adhere to, but getting access to that information if I'm a small company is a pretty difficult thing to do. So a lot of our work really is trying to make this kind of information accessible for small and medium enterprise. Then we also look in the public sector. We're looking at what are the causes of corruption, the most common areas of corruption, especially if we're looking at the private sector and how it affects the private sector. Well, one of the easiest areas is public procurement. The rigging of contracts, the creation of an uncompetitive procurement process. Not only it does harm to governance, not only does it steal from the taxpayer, but it also doesn't allow the private sector to compete on bids fairly and for businesses to grow fairly. And it's an area where we are looking at how the public and private sector can work together to make sure that the process is more accessible, more fair, and more transparent. We also have done a lot of work, as I mentioned earlier, in corporate governance, but these days we're also looking at the state-owned sector. Because corruption in the state-owned sector is a common area of theft, but it's also an area that distorts the competitive environment in the country. If the state-owned sector is being used to favor certain economic players in an environment over others, whether it's through the giving of special privileges or other distortions in the competitive market, we see state-owned enterprises as part of that. So what we're trying to do at CIPE is really move forward a program that's looking to build better corporate governance in state-owned enterprises. The boards of directors of these organizations need to be independent, they need to be qualified, their selection process needs to be transparent, and they need to be accountable. And so we do a lot of work in that regard. And lately we've been looking at a broader area. It's something, for lack of a better term, that we're calling corrosive capital here at CIPE. And that's capital from markets that may not demand as much from a government in terms of investment or in terms of rule of law. And as we're using the term corrosive, they have different levels of acidity to the governance of a country. So, you know, Russian capital in a country might have a very corrosive effect on some forms of governance if we look at the Balkans, for instance. But we're also looking at the phenomena of Chinese capital, both private capital flows but also state capital flows. And how do governments who take on debt on behalf of their country, how do they make these deals with sources of large-scale capital, and what levels of transparency can we encourage into the governments of Africa and in Southeast Asia, places where a lot of these aid flows are now starting to pick up. It's not we're going to stop these kind of aid flows, but we need to understand how they work better, what are these mechanisms, and how can we ensure that they happen transparently and fairly, so that the ultimate recipients and debt payers of these funds, which are the citizens of the countries taking those loans, have assurance that these systems are being done, these deals are being done clearly and transparently. And in addition, that the labor laws, the environmental laws, and anything else that might happen are being enforced ethically. As a result of this work, I'm pleased to announce that this program in particular, but a lot of the events we're doing these days, are in support of two new initiatives we have here at CIPE, two new centers of excellence that we are announcing and rolling out right now. One is a center that we're calling the Anti-Corruption Governance Center here at CIPE. Frank Brown here towards the back in the blue shirt is heading that up, and that's combining some of our work on compliance as well as looking at ways that we can activate civil society more effectively into anti-corruption actions. And then the second center is our Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. And there's Barb Bumel, who's just been appointed as its new director. And this is really an effort here at CIPE to make CIPE a hub for the study of women's entrepreneurship, enabling environment, and other activities and things that we've been doing at CIPE for several years, and realize we have a trove of experience and we really do need to put this together in a much more focused way and a much more responsive way, so we can help our friends around the world more effectively in promoting the role of women in society. I've said enough here. I want to turn things over now to Lars Benson, our Regional Director for Africa. I'm going to switch off my mic and ask our speakers to turn on their mics. And I'll turn it over to you, Lars, to do the introductions and facilitate the discussion.
Great, thank you. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for spending Wednesday afternoon, a couple of hours with us here today. We're really honored to have two fantastic people in the room to talk about women and their role in terms of combating corruption. One of them to my left is Emira Woods. I've learned quite I was trying to, her bio was kind of short. All of you have the bio, so I always try to find something in the press or publicly that I might be able to share, but I didn't get very far with Emira. But she has really a diverse background working for civil society organizations. She's on several boards. She's worked in the private sector. She was a think tanker, if we want to call her that, or a researcher, and has been focused very much on the social economic justice issues. She also worked for something that I'm going to be curious to ask her more about, which was a firm called ThoughtWorks. And it's a tech firm committed to, again, social economic To her left, we have President Banda, former President of Malawi, and again, you all have her bio. She has been listed in several publications as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, so I'm curious what that means exactly. And also, she was sharing with us today, but I was thinking I was going to get something new, which is there's a Club de Madrid, and this is made up of former presidents and prime ministers that support and foster democratic values and leadership. She is also has spent a few years here in the United States, and will be heading back to Africa very, very shortly. So I'm going to start with some of the questions, and Emira, why don't we start with you? Joyce, I'm going to give you a little extra time because you'll be getting the same exact question. What challenges and opportunities do you see today facing women leaders in combating corruption?
Well, first, let me thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Thank you for those who made it possible for me to be on this panel. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for carving out time with a beautiful day outside to join us, and I'm really honored to see some longtime Africanists in the room. They're in the back of the room, and just really want to honor their presence here as well today. So, going to your question, I feel like maybe this is like, I should say spoiler alert, right? Because I am very much a feminist and a progressive, and I believe in the power of women and the importance of women, and critical role that women can play in all levels of society. But when it comes to this question of corruption, we have to just point blank say, it's not a number game. It's almost, and I like to hold up reports and studies, it's the academic in me, right? So there's this beautiful report done by OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is basically the club of rich states that puts together these analyses. And they did this review of 120 reports on gender and corruption. And the bottom line, let me give you the punchline here, is not much correlation. Really interesting analysis, right? I think what the analysis shows is that it is critical to have institutions across society look like the society. So it's important for women, for people of color to be reflected on staff, on boards, across the board, and especially in political leadership. But when it comes to this question of corruption, just women presence in and of itself, unfortunately, it's not a panacea. Let's be frank. I'm from Liberia. We have too many examples that we can cite. We need to have 2 hours for this panel. We would cite that. You have certainly issues across countries, not only in Africa, but certainly Brazil. There are a number of countries now that come to mind where women's political leadership is being questioned because of issues of accountability and transparency. So I think we have to say, as feminists, we need more women. We also have to say, in a very honest and practical way, that the presence of women does not, in and of itself, in any way negate issues of corruption. And so what is needed is greater transparency. It is these institutions like a free press, institutions that bring accountability. It is now these growing civil society organizations that are acting as watchdogs, as purveyors of the public interest, I think, that lead to greater transparency and accountability. And it is the private sector doing its part, because on each release of a Panama paper or a Paradise paper, we see that there are private sector actors. These critical actors have really, been on the wrong side of history. They have been at the other end of these corrupt practices and yet not held accountable. So I think we need to hold people accountable across the board. When there are transgressions, make sure that that no one is above the law, that there is accountability, and that there is the rule of law that's respected. And we have to then make sure that the institutions of accountability, a judiciary, it's free, it's functioning, it is supported. These institutions help to bring greater accountability, efficiency, and actually more fair and stable societies, right? So I think it's a long way to say that we need women, we need parity, both gender and racial parity is critical in the world that we live in today, and the world that we're building for our children. But it is in and of itself not a panacea.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Banda?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me first thank CIPE for inviting me to come and participate in this very important debate. I think what I would like to say first and foremost is for us to understand that men and women leaders are being treated differently. That when women are leaders, they are scrutinized more than men. And that when women are leaders, sometimes even the media treats them unfairly. And I would like to say that my observation, take me aside, each and every woman that has been in leadership is under attack right now. Starting from Australia, where Julia Gillard was pushed out of office by her male colleagues. And we know what happened, but then at the end of the day, she herself straight away was investigated for corruption and was only cleared by the Chief Justice the other day. So I don't want to mention the other countries because I don't want to open that debate. But there's a country where a president had spotted corruption, and she decided that she was going to tackle that corruption. She was going to arrest or to try or to prosecute those that were being mentioned. She was impeached first by the same people that she was investigating. So for me, we have to be extremely careful before we begin to blame women, because it's not possible that all women that have been in State House, all of them are corrupt. Secondly, I would like to say that I'm grateful to NDI because they have, under their chairperson, Madeleine Albright, started a movement at the UN called Not the Cost Campaign to fight abuses towards women in politics. And it has been discovered since that was established that there's not enough data that tells us enough about what women in politics are going through. And so even, and it is unfortunate because then we can discuss here, but we cannot support what we are saying with that. I would like to say that in my personal experience, what I felt from the day that I went into office was resistance. Women have a different style of leadership. So I think the greatest challenge is when you get into leadership, is to try to shift this bottle here because you think that is what you should do. And it is the resistance from all over that says, no, that's not how we do it. We do it this way, yes, but this is wrong. And then you begin to fight from day one. But you need to put your foot down. I have always said that leadership is a love affair. So you fall in love with the people you serve, and the people must fall in love with you. And if you love the people that you serve, you shall not allow anybody to exploit them or to steal from them. But the challenge, I think, is to separate fact from fake news. Though those that are fortunate, like in my case, when you fight corruption, it's not easy. That's what I discovered. That's another challenge, because there's a lot of resistance from those that have benefited from corruption all along. So they'll fight you back. At the end of the day, it's not easy to know what is real and what is fake. I was fortunate myself that when I decided to fight corruption, I had a friend at the World Bank here who told me, conduct a forensic audit, have a document that will vindicate you. Because at the end of the day, when the smear campaign starts, it will not be easy to know what you've done, who did what. And we shall forever be grateful to God, because I asked the British government to fund that forensic audit. So there's that document. So when they begin to fight you, at least you have that to protect you. I think if I didn't have that document, I would be in jail by now. If I didn't have that document, the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Malawi 3-4 weeks ago would not have made a statement vindicating me. So we have to be extremely careful, and I feel sorry for those that are my fellow female leaders, women leaders in positions of leadership that don't know, that maybe don't have a friend at the World Bank who has advised them to do a forensic audit. Because at the end of the day, it is a vicious fight out there to fight corruption. And the people you are fighting are very strong, and they fight you back. At the end of the day, you can actually go to jail for things that you did not do. I think the problem, again, that we find is that when we get into leadership, we already hear that there's corruption. Like in the case of Malawi, from the year 2001, the cabinet minister said, oh, there's no point talking about corruption after all of us are corrupt. 2001. 2006, the Director of Public Prosecution in Malawi said, alerted the government and Malawi that is a lot of 30% of our resources are being stolen. Nothing was done. 2009, somebody was found with 400 million in the account, in his account. Investigation started and died away. So I come in 2013, and I was fortunate that the ambassador to the European Union by the name of Alexander Baum alerted me to say, check the financial management system. We alerted your predecessors, they didn't want to take action, to check. And straight away we started the fight. And straight away we started arresting people. But they told me, we shall go down together. The choice you have to make as a leader is what is more important for me. My husband told me, you know that you may not be re-elected because of this. And you know that you may go down because of this. I said, yes, that's a small price to pay. If I'm genuine about loving the people I serve, then State House is not a big deal to give up. After all this life, after State House, here I am at State site, having a meeting, and I'm not a president, so it's okay. So those are the sacrifices one has to make. But it is for you to change the status quo. And I think the final challenge, this is what I've discovered after office now, that I was told by somebody working for these big institutions, financial institutions, IMF and World Bank, that when you blow the whistle as a head of state, you decide that I'm going to do something about the situation, this corruption. You raise your country on the index. So countries that cover up, nobody will ever know this country, there's corruption in that country. So they look good on the index. I mean, you can do investigations. But when you say, Malawi, here I am, I have arrested 72 people, like I did in Malawi, then it shows on your index, you can even be declared the most corrupt country in the world. Sometimes you are advised as head of state. That's a big challenge for you to deal with as a woman. When your colleagues will tell you, cover up, it's not beneficial for your country to expose this corruption.
Thank you. Emira, I want to follow up on something that you started to address, which is the debate around myth or reality and whether women are less corrupt than men. Clearly, you've talked about some of these OECD studies that talk about that as being a myth. But what I think some of the research does show is that even though the corruption is not gender neutral, but it impacts women a lot more. Dr. Banda was also perhaps talking about that. Perhaps you can address that side of corruption.
Absolutely, that's the easy side to address, right? Because if you look at, I mean, there have been so many panels. Tabo and Becky did one very high-profile panel on the illicit financial flows out of Africa, which showed that the money flowing out of the continent, right, in the form of illicit transfer, of pricing, of commodities, and the whole range of outflows, total $70 billion, estimated at $70 billion annually, which is more than aid, more than trade. It's, remittances are slightly higher, so as a diaspora, I always like to look at those remittances numbers, right? But if you think about what's leaving the continent because of these illicit practices, and the illicit economies that are driving those illicit practices, I think it is scandalous. And so if you look at the impact, what could happen on the continent in terms of funding for healthcare, for education, for mitigating climate change in the midst of where Africa is at the forefront of the climate catastrophe. What could happen in terms of technology and support for young people with the booming demographics we have on the continent and all the creativity that is every day developing new and amazing ways to communicate and to kind of innovate. I think it is what's lost that we have to look at when we think about the illicit flows and what what it means, what the impacts are. I think there's a disproportionate impact on women and children who are disproportionately using the healthcare and the education systems across the board. So I think we've got to acknowledge that, and we've got to also say, to what extent, Ambassador Banda was great in mentioning these institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. They have a critical role to play, and there's a lot that can happen in terms, especially of capital controls. How do you create mechanisms where funds can remain in the country and be used within the country? I think those elements of capital control, those elements of regulating economies in a way that the revenue can actually benefit those in the country, I think could go a long way towards stemming this tide of the illicit financial flows impacting particularly women and children. I think we've got to also look at the institutions that have played a role. So it's again, Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, it's like an open book now, right? But the international banks that have been involved, the international law firms that have been involved, many of them are in this country, in this city, right? So how do we talk about accountability across the board, from the level of corporate decision makers, to those who were actually making the decisions and making the deals happen in country? I think there needs to be accountability across the board to minimize the negative impact of this type of illicit activity.
Dr. Banda, as we're talking about corruption, sub-Saharan African countries still score in the bottom of the Transparency International Perception of Corruption Index. And even though a lot of African laws and regulations are actually pretty good in combating corruption, I think Kenya has 55, some constitutional amendments as well. Why is it that Africa doesn't seem to be moving forward as quickly as perhaps some other regions of the world in terms of combating corruption?
I think that, let me start from where my sister left off, that the effect on women and children, the effect of illicit moving funds out of Africa on women and girls, cannot be overemphasized. But I think again what must wake us up is the fact that now America has decided to be nationalistic. Now we hear it's America first, it's Britain first. And I have always said that I think it's a good opportunity for Africa to wake up and realize that we too have to put our priorities right. And I always say in my speeches that Africa is not poor. In any case, the richest man that ever lived was an African. So we need to put our priorities right. We are a very rich continent. And I think me talking on behalf of my fellow leaders, it is to ensure that we put it in our mind that the resources that we have in our countries don't belong to us, belong to the people that we serve. But the good news is that there's so many countries now, and I can count 10, in any case the fastest growing economies on African countries now in the world. I can count more than 10 of countries now that are doing it right. And I think when we look at what is happening in Botswana, we should be proud as Africa. And therefore, it is very important for us to take off from there and to make sure that those act as models. Perhaps my request to the international community would be that when they are those leaders that stick their neck out and they put their foot down and say, in my country, I'm going to fight. I'm going to ensure that there's no corruption. I'm going to ensure that the natural resources that we have belong to the people and not to me. And then there is resistance. The international community should step in to support that leader. The leaders that are fighting corruption should not end up looking like victims, but as victors. And so therefore they will need support from everybody. The Panama Papers have also shown us that corruption is a global problem. That it is in the West and it is in Africa and it is everywhere. And I've always also said in my speeches that the West needs to help us. We need to fight this together. Because sometimes I get the view that the West are enablers. Why is it that I am a president in my country, I've retired, I come to the US, I buy 5 houses, they're just looking at me. You need to question me, how much was it that you were getting for you to be able to buy 5 houses? When I leave my country with the money I have stolen in my country, and I come into America or UK and open a huge account, I must be queried, how did you make this money? So it is hypocrisy sometimes. That's how I feel. That I was a head of state, and I get into UK, or I get into America, and I open a huge account, and people are just looking at me. I say this because for 2 years I spent fighting to try to get money that was stuck in so many foreign banks back home where it belongs for that development you're talking about, for the people of my country, but the money never came. There is also resistance for countries to send back the money that was stolen, that is stuck in overseas banks. So for me, I think there's a great opportunity for foreign countries and our countries in Africa to work together, to fight corruption together. And so therefore, we must not feel that there's any safe haven somewhere where when I steal I can run there. Or UK or US must not receive that money and refuse to remit it back to where it belongs.
So Emira, Dr. Banda was talking about how the international community should support those African leaders that are combating corruption. If you take a look at elections in Africa, the opposition or even somebody who's coming into power afterwards, when you take a look at just the last 2 years, corruption is always an issue. It's always part of the political campaign. What are some of the, so how do we know that those leaders are really serious about combating corruption? And what can the international community also do in addition to spending some of the illicit financial things?
So thank you so much for that, Lars. I feel like I want to go back to your earlier question about Africa, right? Because
Okay.
come on, you all, we're you know, the 21st century. We've got to really unpack this and understand that corruption, especially in this city, especially now, you know, the South Africans are using this term state capture. And I think many of us in DC feel like, ooh, there's some state capture that might be happening here as well. So I really want to, you know, kind of debunk that, because it is not just Africa. Let's be really, really clear. And it is often multinational corporations that are based in Europe or the US that have been at the forefront of these corrupt practices. So I think we've got to, you know, we've got to kind of get at that and make sure that we're clear that the accountability has to be across the board and across countries as well. And so on this question of elections, I think, you know, President Banda talks about the resources of Africa and going to the people of Africa. And to me, that harkens back to the words of President Lumumba, who was one of the liberation leaders and our real heroes on the continent, who basically said those words, that the resources of Africa must feed the children of Africa. This was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, then called Zaire, right? And he was now, everything's been declassified, so it's really like open that he was assassinated with the US and the UK complicit. So we have had incredible leaders. You know, I also, one of also the heroes is Thomas Sankara, who wasn't a woman, but a feminist. Can you imagine Amasakara not only changed the name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of upright people. I feel like that could be a plug for go see Panther or whatever. Yes, I did go Thursday night when it opened, but anyway, the point is, he was a feminist who had equal pay for equal work. Not in Washington, D.C., right? Okay. But in Burkina Faso in 1980s, late 80s, right? But he was assassinated in 1987, right? And in each of these cases where you had these visionary leaders, they were stripped from us, right? And instead, others put in place. In the case of Democratic Republic of the Congo, you all know the story. It was Mobutu, who was kept in place for almost 40 years, right? And received more funding from the World Bank than all presidents on the continent combined, right? So, when the leadership, the visionary leadership has been there. And I do think we've got to understand that the continent has produced those leaders. And we have gone through an incredible period where it's almost as if the power of the state has been stripped away through a range of practices where they're more beholden now to the World Bank and IMF than to their own people, right? And I think some of these fundamental flaws have to be really addressed if we're going to answer your question in an honest way. So clearly there are countries across the continent where leaders are kind of putting in place. For example, we're watching South Africa unfold. Where a president is being held personally accountable for these practices, both in terms of a nuclear deal being made and the payoffs related to that, in terms of all these other, there are too many issues to begin to talk about. But the fact that it was young people pushing for accountability, young people in social movements finding their voice, and using that voice to demand change, to demand accountability. And I think really putting serious pressure on the political apparatus in ways that harken back to the anti-apartheid struggle. And I think these are our leaders of the future, right? And so yeah, I'm very much I'm watching across the world. You see these young people in Florida. It's high school students, right? That are saying, no more, not on our watch. And these will be the political elected officials of the future. And so whether it's on that or on immigration reform and all the questions of our time, it is young people that are forcing these issues of accountability, that are developing through the use of technology, new tools to kind of follow budgets and track where money's going and demand accountability. And also to kind of address the power imbalance, whether it is the power of corporate interests, the power of international financial interests, demanding that particularly communities on whose land those resources lie actually benefit from those resources, and that the planet is protected for the future. I think these are the young leaders that are going to bring forward a whole new standard of transparency, accountability, and justice. And so I think our task, to take the weight of corruption, is to open up the space for these young leaders and to encourage that type of value-driven leadership to kind of take hold.
Thank you. President Banda, just building off of that theme, you have a foundation that I know does quite a bit of work with young women leaders and others, or youth in Malawi. And I would like to really go back to this whole issue about women or economic empowerment, especially for those that are disenfranchised or marginalized, in terms of how do we mobilize them to get involved in fighting corruption. Emira has mentioned something about social accountability and new tech and new tools. but perhaps you have some practical examples that you can share in terms of some of the work your foundations.
Yeah, two areas. One is economic empowerment and the other is education. I've just finished doing my research at the Center for Global Development and Wilson Center. And at the Center for Global Development, I was focusing on 0 to 10. And I feel as a woman leader that the world is earmarking a lot of resources for the adolescent girl child, 11, 14. But as an African woman, I know that we can lose this girl child from 0 to 10. There's so much that is happening during that time. The other research that I did was on women's participation in leadership. The two papers are related because I'm also insisting that leaders are born. And they are saying that leaders are born with 30% traits. And the 70% have to be developed. So if a girl child is born in a family where the environment is not good enough, the one I'm describing in my book and in my paper, there's no way we can capture the 30% and take advantage of it and empower this girl child and send her to school. So for me, it starts with education. And for me, I'm also recommending in my book and in those papers that we need to start providing rights education to the girl child from age 3 and the boy child from age 3. There's an organization called Think Equal, and Think Equal is an organization started by a lady by the name of Leslie Goodwin, who is based in the UK. And that is the organization that started to develop curriculum for early childhood education centers to provide that rights education from age 3. And fortunately, working with UNESCO, 116 countries have signed up and started providing that curriculum from January this year. So it's education. Economic empowerment for those women that have missed out on education. Because I think they become vulnerable even to corruption, even when they try to run businesses, because they're not economically empowered. So if the girls are educated, they can go through and get a profession and they become leaders. But if they missed out on education, then they need to become economically empowered. Because it's only when, even at household level, when she begins to contribute to the economic capacity of the household, that she can begin to participate in decision making at that household level. And that's when the time that she can also begin to make decisions about herself, her well-being, the education of her children, and the health status of the family, but also she will insist that the girl child goes to school. Most of the women that I've worked with in the foundation, when you get in the village, they will always tell you, I'm working hard so that I can send my girl child to school, so that this curse of poverty and the lack of education ends with me. So if she has income, bringing the income into the household, she will send her girl child to school. But then when you go into, I believe that women can be vulnerable because they are not educated. Even when we try to stand for elected office, you need the financial capacity to be able to compete with men on equal ground, so that you are not exploited, you are not abused, you are not used. You can even be bought. We've seen women standing for office and they're likely winners in that constituency. The man who has money will just come and give her money and say, withdraw your candidature. And then she withdraws. And then the man wins, who will never even develop or support that constituency. But this person who was going to do a good job in this constituency had to withdraw, to step down, but I know that I can win. I have found that when women are economically empowered, whether they have been to school or not, they begin to mobilize themselves. So women have formed what we are calling the African Women Leaders Network at the UN Women last June, because we want to continue to raise our voice in different sectors, in bringing networks on the African continent together, and to raise our voice and to encourage younger women. And so in this meeting that we had in New York, I think more than 1/3 were young women. We believe that as we grow, we also must develop younger women. And what I have found on the African continent, and that proves what I'm saying in my paper, is that the African women start show their leadership and to become leaders at a very young age. I can give examples, but I'll waste your time. But I know that economic empowerment and education are the two things that are going to help fight corruption in Africa, as far as women are concerned.
Excellent, thank you.